Welcome, gentle reader. Thank you for being with us on this glorious day in Everything is Everything. Do you like the frame? Do you like the light? You know, it's all contingent. Life is contingent. Change is ever present. And it depends on what the rain gods want to do with us. What do you think, Amit?
It does, and I think that, being in nature like this with the birds singing over our head, a friend sitting nearby, the possibility of looking into your mobile phone for hours and ignoring all of this, no, not that last part. But, being in a surrounding like this is priceless. And yet today we are not going to discuss priceless things, we are going to discuss prices.
Prices.
So our episode is on a subject you're an expert in fact, even a pioneer in an Indian context, which is inflation targeting. But before we kind of talk about inflation targeting, what I want to do is demystify it a bit and talk about inflation and how I understand it from really simple terms. So this is like a really dumbed down, simplistic version, right? What is inflation? Inflation is rising prices, right? How are prices determined? By supply and demand. So prices change whenever there is, supply changes or demand changes. So one way in which that could happen is, say we are used to eating apples, all the apples come from a nearby orchard, but there is a maggot infestation there and there are no apples one particular season. What happens? The supply of apples goes down, and therefore the price goes up because the demand is still the same and the price goes up, and that is one way in which prices rise. However, that's not what we mean by inflation. By inflation, what is meant is that by and large everything has gone up. Tomatoes have gone up, onions have gone up, mobile phones have gone up, everything kind of goes up in a certain way. And when does this happen? And my realization was when I thought about it in terms of money on one side of the picture and goods and services on the other side of the picture. And there is a balance between the two. There's a certain amount of money chasing a certain number of goods and services, and there are prices between them reflecting the demand and supply. But if you change the quantity of the money, then what happens is, for example, if the government decides we'll print more money and they print 20% more money, then you have 20% more money, the goods and services are the same. So therefore, everything will cost more by, some percentage or the other. And that inflation, as it were, is then widely spread. Now, Milton Friedman once famously said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Monetary refers to this money supply, right? We have fiat currencies. The state has a monopoly on money. They print the money effectively. They control how much of it is out there. And therefore, they can raise or deplete the supply. Demonetization was a classic example of temporarily depleting it by a long way. And they can raise it for all kinds of reasons. There can be political reasons. You want to spend on X, Y, Z. You don't have the money to do it. You just print the money and you spend it on that. And everybody says, government is doing so much. It works politically. But what you have done is that you have raised prices for everybody. And the new money that comes into the system is not distributed in proportion to what people already have. So inevitably, the poor are the greatest sufferers, which is why I keep reminding people, inflation is a tax on the poor, right? If there is rampant inflation, you have to hold your government accountable. So that's like a broad sort of way of looking at it. And hyperinflation would, for example, be where the government prints so much that you don't just have inflation, you have prices going completely out of whack. Germany right after the First World War was a great example of this, where the reparations asked by the winning nations were so incredibly high that Germany had no option but to print tons of money. And what that meant was that what you could buy a house with is what you would need to buy a loaf of bread a week later. And it just went out of whack, and it led eventually to the rise of the right-wing extremism that led to Adolf Hitler. And in fact, one reason for, John Maynard Keynes at that time had, when he wrote this pamphlet called The Economic Consequences of the War, pointed out that the economic consequences of the peace, had pointed out that one reason this happens is that we don't know national wealth. We don't know what's going on, and therefore we can make demands that are too crazy, as those demands were. And so the demand for something that resembles a GDP, which didn't then exist, came into being, and that's a whole different story. I have a great seen unseen episode on the GDP. We'll link from here. So that's a broad situation that when prices go up, it has something to do with the money supply, and obviously governments aren't any more printing printing money. You can use it as a metaphor at best, but the central bank, which has a monopoly on money, can through interest rates manipulate the supply of money, and therefore inflation is directly in its control. So that is sort of my short simple narrative, so that somebody who's never thought about it before can, I mean, this is basically the linear order in which I began to understand inflation and money. So, Ajay, at this point, I want to lead to you and ask you a question that, okay, broadly we are saying inflation is rising prices, but, rising prices of what? How do you decide what is an inflation rate? What are you measuring exactly? So, give me a sense of, how states and statisticians and all that begin to sort of measure this problem and get a grip on it.
You could start at your personal consumption, okay, vast amounts of bacon, tiny amounts of bread, and then you could tote up your expenses. So quantity of bacon multiplied by price of bacon, expenditure on bacon, dot, 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 okay. And then next month with a different set of prices, you could compute your personal inflation rate, that Amit Bhai eats the same amount of bacon every month. Okay, Amit Bhai is a good devout non-vegetarian and he eats bacon as a matter of principle. So you could calculate inflation rate customized to you, which is the cost of your basket. You buy certain things and you take your quantities, your prices, multiply them together, and then month after month that can be computed. And as you correctly said, there will always be internal fluctuations. Okay, so on average, luck is zero. Some things are positive, some things are negative. So some days apples are expensive, some days oranges are cheap. Okay, so on average, there will always be an idiosyncratic noise where some things go up and some things go down. But the average overall systematic increase in the cost of your basket is your inflation, is your truth, is your inflation. Okay, and each person in the country can do this. So what economic statisticians do is the following. Step one, they conduct vast scale household surveys to measure the consumption of everybody in the country. Okay, so as an example, the CMIE household survey attempts to measure about 190,000 households 3 times a year, and for each household it asks questions about some 90 separate elements of the consumption. That how much are you spending on tuition fees for your kids? It's sort of at that level of detail.
But no bacon.
But no bacon. I think they have some generic categories called meat and fish and so on, but not the subtlety of bacon. Okay, so this is how the economic measurement is done of the behavior of a large amount of households. Then they are aggregated and you get an overall average of the weights in the consumption basket. So there are poor people, rich people, vegetarians, carnivores. They all have weights of what is the percentage share of school fees of children in your household consumption. Okay, and you get one such list of weights for each household and you average them across the entire country, and that gives you the overall average weightage of what the households are buying. Okay, and imagine that you then compute that weighted average of prices based on this average basket. That leads to a price index, that leads to a measure of inflation. Okay, so the consumer price index is this, that we measure a large number of households, we express their consumption in as a certain weighted basket, and then month after month we go back, find out all those prices. The weights stay the same for a couple of years. Every month the prices change. So you plug in this month's prices and you get a price index for this month. Okay, and then you keep going like this, and you get the measure of inflation for India. So it reflects the average inflation as perceived by the overall average of India. No two people are alike and each will differ in their subjective experience, but this is an average which reflects the overall average of what's going on in the country. And right here I want to say that in general one should always be skeptical about government data. When there is a broad lack of state capability in the country, it afflicts everything. So the same government that fares poorly on the police and the judiciary and the air quality in North India will also fare poorly in statistical measurement and the release of data. So I don't mean to single out the people doing economic measurement, but it's hard. It's a government organization. They will have their own foibles. So all government data should be viewed with great skepticism. And many years ago, when Ila Patnaik and I were working systematically in this field, we thought that it would be good to cross-check the veracity of this data. So we used the CMI household survey to obtain the weights, and we cross-checked the weights against the weights as used in the CPI data of the government, and they broadly checked. Then we used private sector data sources for prices, and we cross-checked them against the government's data, and broadly they checked out fine. Okay, so we are fairly confident that the Indian government mechanisms for making the CPI are reasonably sound. Okay, so these are not trivial statements to make. As you know, we are very skeptical about many parts of government data, most famously the GDP data. But for that reason, we thought it's a hygiene check that, you can't go further with applications of the government CPI if you're going to mistrust the foundations of measurement. But mercifully, in this case, the data works out pretty good. So you can use the government CPI with reasonable confidence. While I'm on this subject, gentle reader, a pro tip that there is a thing that the government computes, which is the wholesale price index, the WPI. I won't go into it in detail, but you must know 3 propositions. First, that there is nothing wholesale about the wholesale price index. It's just confusing that when people start thinking wholesale price index versus consumer price index, is this something to do with the retailing margins or something like that? And it's just rubbish. Don't go down that route. It means nothing. I won't bother explaining in detail. Second, the wholesale price index is not a meaningful price index because it is nobody's consumption basket. It has no interpretation. It is some random weights made up by some economists. Finally, the wholesale price index is a useful database of a large number of subcomponent prices. So for hundreds of objects like nickel, you will get a nickel price index from the WPI database, and you will look skeptical, like what human being eats nickel? So, how can nickel be in a wholesale price index? And so just don't use the WPI for anything other than this one good application, which is, it's a nice long-term database of prices in India. That's a good use of the underlying component prices. Once it's aggregated as an index, it makes no sense at all.
So the wholesale price index is basically not wholesale, not an index, and not a price by itself.
Yeah, so it's just people very widely go wrong with using these things. I'm happy to discuss in great detail later, but this is my headline summary. Use the CPI. CPI is a decent, good index, and it is meaningful. Use the WPI underlying component prices as a database.
So Ajay, let's talk about why is inflation important? Like, when inflation goes out of whack, like something, when there's hyperinflation and a loaf of bread today, costs as much as a house tomorrow, obviously it's a problem. But otherwise, 1-2 percentage points, how does it matter? Explain.
Or even imagine if you live in a market environment where the inflation is compensated to you by wage hikes or by income hikes, then are you protected? Okay, like, so imagine you're a self-employed doctor. Okay, when inflation happens, you'll charge more to your patients. So it seems like a minor problem, and it is easy to think that it is there, but it's not that important.
Except some of your patients die because food is so expensive they can't afford it anymore, and then you have less patients. I'm kidding. Continue. Don't answer me seriously.
Okay. I was about to launch into answering you seriously that what do we know in the literature about the impact of inflation shocks on mortality and infant mortality and such like. Yeah, don't even get me started. Okay. So sometimes people think that inflation is the price of growth. If you're going to have high growth, then having a little bit of inflation is okay. And there is some sense in which these are correlated, but I think this is actually a very poor idea, and the sooner we get rid of this, the better. So it is interesting and important to ask the question, why is inflation important, and should one devote institutional apparatus to the conquest of inflation? And I solidly believe the answer is yes.
When I ask why it is important, both of us right now are talking about reasons beyond the obvious moral reason at the start. That is, it's a tax on the poor and therefore a redistribution of wealth from the poor to the rich. Apart from that,
So I want to go deep into the working of the price system. Okay, so again and again we have been pushing the knowledge and the intuition of the price system, and core to that is this either Hindu or Buddhist philosophy of a world that is ever changing. Okay, the world is ever changing, and the job of the self-organizing system, the distributed decentralized information processing of the economic society, consists of comprehending that changing world and feeding it back into a correct and improved resource allocation. So the world keeps on changing, technology changes, tastes change. Each firm, each individual, each consumer, each producer, each self-employed person is looking at this bewildering world where things are changing all the time and applying mind and applying a finite amount of CPU power to thinking, what should I be doing differently? Okay, so we have emphasized this idea that prices convey signals, but they convey signals to somebody. Like, it has to go into the mind of a firm, and then the firm will think and apply its own information processing and come up with ideas for what it should do different. Now, when a firm decides to do something different, it's not a trivial matter changing. Okay, you want to change the techniques that you use in production. You want to change the locations of your factories. You want to hire some people, you want to fire some people. All this adjustment is not easy. So think of a finite budget of adjustment muscle. Every firm has to look at the world and keep on adapting, but adapting is exhausting. It's not a small matter. It is the great ask of the market economy that, look, the world keeps on changing, you have to keep on changing. You can't sit quiet and silent and say we'll keep on doing the same things forever. Okay, you have to keep responding to a changing world, and changing is hard. Some of the people like us who are making this show and are watching this show have an oversupply of cognitive capacity and do not have adequate empathy for the difficulty of many people in just keeping up with the modern world. The world changes all the time. Every year is getting shorter, never seem to find the time. So it's so difficult to comprehend what is going on. Okay, so into this problem of a finite amount of adjustment capability and the infinite complexity of the world, think of what inflation does. So when inflation happens, you are seeing prices change, but those prices don't reflect the changes in the actual economy. They reflect the problems of money and monetary policy and the overall price changes. This is a signal processing problem for each firm, for each individual. When I see the prices of apples going up, is it because apples are scarce? Is it that the ability to grow apples went down? Is it that consumers want more apples? Or is it just that there was overall inflation? Like, how do I disentangle these two? And it's actually quite hard to disentangle these two. There's also an empirical fact that when overall inflation is high, the overall variability of all prices is higher. So the deep insight is that high inflation messes with the information processing problem of firms. So in countries where there is high inflation, it also tends to be high and variable inflation. You can't get high and stable inflation. And also when inflation is high and variable, then there is just much more noise in the cross-sectional variation of inflation. All this throws the information processing of firms out of whack. Firms find it more difficult to figure out the world. Firms get misled. They go off into wrong adjustments, thinking that, oh, the world has changed in this fashion and I must respond to it. But actually, it was just inflation, and they were wrong to go off initiating an adjustment of the resource allocation into these directions. Okay, so this is a deep insight. This is coming from Milton Friedman's 1968 paper and many other things that he wrote, that the reason why inflation is important is because it interferes with that ceaseless dance of the market economy, of firms, consumers, all economic agents ceaselessly readjusting their economic designs in a changing world. So nobody wants to take away the fact that the world is changing and people must respond to it. Okay, so this is not a call for government fixed prices or some artificial notions of stability underwritten and guaranteed by the government, like a fixed exchange rate or anything like that. The world changes and people must deal with the change. But is there a way to reorganize the government, which might be a source of high and variable inflation, and instead change the government to deliver low and stable inflation? That is an entirely fair ask. That, can you build the institutional apparatus in government so that inflation is low and stable, and then invisibly there is a calm and greater predictability and understandability, comprehensibility of the world according to the firms and the consumers, and then they are able to do a better job of what they do. And what they do is ceaselessly adjust production in a way that caters to a changing world, and that creates a high growth environment because the firms are getting things right. Okay? So this is one great pillar of understanding why it is so important to deliver low and stable inflation.
Let me paraphrase it and tell me if I've understood or summarized it correctly. A market is a beautiful mechanism through which people fulfill each other's needs to mutual benefit. And the key condition for doing this is that information flows in an efficient and decentralized way, and that happens through prices. When prices are determined by what people want and what people can produce through demand and supply, accordingly, producers adjust, consumers adjust to each other, and that is what a healthy society should be. Everyone's changing all the time, but that information is going back constantly and people are sort of adjusting to that. However, when a change in price happens not because of a change in society, but because of a change in the money supply, then it becomes a problem. It can create a distortion. If, those sort of fluctuations are not predictable, if it can suddenly go out of whack, then it becomes really hard. Because if you're a producer, say if I make apples and the price of apples goes up, should I then dedicate more of my farmland to making more apples because the price has gone up? Or did the price go up not because of demand, but because of, this distortion, this noise, as you correctly said, that interferes with the signal? And therefore, the rationale here is that, look, let us function. Markets are a great mechanism. Society is doing its own job. Everybody is helping everybody else. And all the government needs to do is, buggers, we gave you the monopoly on money. You had one job. Keep it stable. Don't mess with it too much.
Perfect. So, in the use of information in society, there is a
use of knowledge in society. See, I caught you this time. Yeah. One all.
In the use of knowledge in society, the heavy lifting is being done by prices. Now don't put noise into prices. Okay, so this is one block of reasoning, that low and stable inflation creates the maximal conditions for good growth, because good growth comes out of the energy and brain power and adjustment muscle of the firms. And don't put noise into their faces. Don't give them a dashboard with wrong information. Give them the correct information and then let them struggle it through. Let me belabor the cost of adjustment idea. Okay, this is around all nominal contracting. So imagine you and I are two firms and we wrote a contract that you would deliver me episodes of a podcast every week and I would pay you 10 lakh rupees every week.
I just want to tell dear listeners, we're not getting any money for this. It's a labor of love. So I love this hypothetical scenario. Kindly,
we're economists. We do hypothetical scenarios. Okay, and that's written into a contract. Rupees 1 million will be paid per podcast to the great podcaster. Okay, that's a nominal contract. It's written 1 million rupees. Now, the length of the rupee keeps fluctuating because of inflation. So we entered into a complex negotiation and we ended up with a contract. Firms take a lot of time and effort to write contracts, to develop contracts with each other. Remember the intuition? There's a cell wall which is the boundary of the firm, and firm to firm relationships are the land of contracts. The overall resource allocation is a list of firms and their internal behavior and their across firm contracts. So every firm is a raft of people, processes, contracts, because the contracts are what bind the firm to others in the ecosystem. We've written a nominal contract. With great effort, we developed an agreement that you will do this, I will do this, you will do this, I will do this. Under these circumstances, you will do that. And everything is written down in nominal rupees. Now, high and variable inflation is the acid that drips on these contracts and destroys their meaning. Like we had agreed on 1 million rupees, but suddenly inflation took place and prices went up by 9%, and suddenly now you are unhappy. I know you're paying me 1 million rupees per podcast episode, but it's really not a fair price, not under present conditions. And see, Mr. Beer Biceps, he gets paid so much better than me, and I'm not being paid well. Okay, so we get thrown back into a contract renegotiation. So a lot of the time and trouble of the firms gets wasted on renegotiation around nominal contracts. And this is an example of the finiteness of contracting muscle. Contracts can and should be renegotiated. New contracts should emerge all the time, but they should be in response to the real developments of the market economy, where tastes and technology changes, and we want to go build a better firm. Here, it's depreciation of contracts. We're running to stand still. We are damaging we're damaging our existing production arrangements because of that external inflation. Okay, so that's like this intuition of, think of a finite supply of contracting muscle, of adjustment muscle. The firms are trying hard every day to figure out a complex world and renegotiating contracts, coming up with new contracts, and into that, this acid called inflation is interfering with their work, and it is a depreciation that is damaging their work.
So at this point, I have a request for gentle readers that, as you might have noticed, there are many musical references going on here. So down in the comments below, I want you to list all the musical references that you got. Please do that for me. If you don't do that, I will be unsatisfied.
Okay. The third and last element of why inflation is costly is very person-centric. Okay, it is about you, Amit. It is about you, gentle reader. Think of your life. Okay, we all make plans. We are human. Okay, we see the future, we imagine the future, we make plans about the future, and the best of us make 40-year plans and 100-year plans. Okay, now when you make plans for the future, you have to embed many assumptions and calculations about the deep future. You need to have expectations about interest rates, expectations about nominal contracts, all these things. You're going to build a highway, you will toll it for 20 years. Okay, you want to be able to make some assumptions for that calculation. Here again, high and variable inflation just ruins the ability of people to do any kind of long-term planning. In an environment with high and variable inflation, the future gets reduced into the present. Your planning horizon shrinks. There's a terrifying narrowness of vision that, I can see a couple of years. Beyond that, I don't know what the hell is going to happen. Let's not make long-term plans. And that's bad for the country, because growth works well. You get high growth when people will make long-term plans and be able to build and execute complex projects that take many years. So this is reason 3 why low inflation matters. So to summarize, the position of this field is that the highest contribution that a central bank can make to human society is to deliver low and stable inflation. To pursue any other objectives is a fatuous mistake, and by pursuing any other objectives, you will always end up sacrificing on this core objective. The core dharma of a central bank is to deliver low and stable inflation. And if they will narrow their minds and only deliver that, and be held accountable to only deliver that, that is the best that they can do for society. When we divert them for any other objectives, or we give them arbitrary power and the lack of accountability through which they respond to other pulls and pressures and tugs, then they will sacrifice on this core objective, and that is damaging to growth. So this whole story is about one thing, it is growth. The highest god is growth. Can you get an environment with higher GDP growth? And a central bank is an important and valuable participant in that overall symphony. But the drum he plays is low and stable inflation. He should do nothing else. He should deliver us this one thing, and we should applaud when they deliver this one thing. I think it was Keynes who said that if central bankers would be humble like dentists, that would be a pretty fine thing.
Dentists are humble.
We always use grandmothers and dentists.
Yeah,
somehow.
we do use grandmothers.
I think Keynes said if economists were humble like dentists, but it always gets used around central banks because there's just something about central banking.
So, when you say the highest God, it is almost as if like gods are standing, there's a
Yeah,
tier
there are
of,
chotu gods.
there's chotu gods and
Yeah,
there are higher
yeah.
gods.
Growth is the
But
greatest god.
growth is the greatest God. And, we want to underscore that why is growth the greatest God? Growth is the greatest God because our moral imperative as a nation is to tackle poverty. Only growth gets you out of poverty. We've discussed this in great detail in this magnificent episode we did on development, up on the mountains of Bir, where so we had to go to the highest place to talk about a highest God. Isn't that how you would say it?
We contemplated higher things.
So, Ajay, we know the enemy. The enemy is inflation, or rather, the enemy is high and variable inflation. Some inflation is inevitable and is bound to happen. How do we get it under control? Like, what is the framework? How do we think about this?
Um, the central bank is a government agency which gets given power by the parliament to create fiat money. Okay. Now, it is a fundamental principle of public administration that power should always be matched by accountability mechanisms. There should never be unchecked power. Every time there is a power, it should be surrounded by checks and balances. Okay. So, gentle reader, you should look at our episode on public choice theory, and this is a simple application of public choice theory, that just because somebody is appointed to build and run a central bank, it doesn't make them good guys. Okay. They've been given power by the parliament, and they are creating fiat money, and they could pursue personal objectives. They could be wrong, they could make mistakes. Okay. So, ever present in all government organizations is the possibility of failure. So, the thinkers in the world of public administration were looking for a way to close this loophole, that how do you create accountability for a central bank. And then an important innovation came in New Zealand in 1987, which was the idea of an inflation target. Okay, so just think about it very intuitively. We know that inflation is only made by a central bank. The parliament has created a central bank with the sole purpose of making fiat money, and fiat money done wrong can give you inflation that is high and variable. So, the parliament writes sections of law that tie down the central bank and say that we hold you accountable. You will deliver me a certain inflation target. Okay. And in the genius of New Zealand in 1987, they invented bonuses for the senior central bank staff. So, if the central bank governor delivers an inflation outcome that is close to the target, she gets a bonus. Okay. So, it is simple agency theory that there will be nothing lofty. We'll treat you like a dentist. If you did a root canal surgery and the tooth works out fine, then we'll give you a bonus. Okay. So, it's very simple principal agent relationship, that the parliament is the principal and the central bank is the agency. So, when an agency is given a job by the parliament must also code the sections of law that create accountability. So, there will be no powerful agencies with some lofty mystique or independent authority to act as they please. That is not democracy. That is the administrative state. In liberal democracy, the parliament controls the use of the coercive power of the state, and every time it doles out little dollops of that coercive power, it creates the corresponding accountability mechanism. And so that is how this problem was addressed in the history of monetary policy. So, for hundreds of years, fiat money had been created and it generated one disaster after another. So, in country after country, central banks have been a profound failure through world history. Okay? This is a very bad history of failure upon failure. For the first time, things started falling into place where central banks actually started delivering a reasonable level of performance, starting in 1987, where inflation targeting came. And just for a quick summary, today all the advanced economies have this approach of inflation targeting. Some of them are too polite or too cheap to offer a bonus. So, the inflation target is everywhere. They are held accountable and they suffer reputational and other kinds of damage when they fail on their target.
I find this a particularly elegant solution for the following reason, that there are institutions that we do agree should be kinda independent of the state so that they are not, used for political reasons and manipulated. But at the same time, it's a liberal democracy. You also have to be accountable. Now, we would not want a central bank to be basically run by the government itself, because then it could do all kinds of populist things and there would be disaster. However, nor do you want to say that they should be completely independent and,
Whatever they want.
whatever they want, and they can be captured by special interests, and shit can go wrong there as well. And I find the inflation target a beautiful, elegant mechanism to keep them accountable without necessarily manipulating them, where you define the role, and you say that you have one job, and this is, your inflation target. This, you do whatever it takes. This is what you gotta do, and we won't interfere beyond that. But if you don't get there, you are accountable. And this sort of, in my mind, avoids the overreach on either direction.
Correct. Yeah, I want to spell out either direction more clearly. So everything you said is correct, but I just want to spell it out in words that leave nothing to the imagination. At one extreme is a central bank that is not independent. It is controlled by the government. What will happen? Even if it doesn't go crazy supporting populist schemes of the government, what we've seen in advanced economies in the data is that there is an election business cycle. So whenever an election is approaching in the last 1 or 2 years, the central bank will tend to keep interest rates low in order to give everybody a feel-good factor in the economy that, oh, things are great, the inflation is coming with a lag, but you feel good and you're more likely to vote for the incumbent. So this is election manipulation done by the party in power through the agency of the central bank. So all the lofty claims of central bankers that, oh, we are something special, actually when you look in the data for advanced economies, it is full of this election business cycle. When the time comes for that one-on-one, heart-to-heart between a finance minister and the leadership of a central bank, the leadership of the central bank will buckle and they will do what a finance minister wants. This is one kind of caricature. And the other kind of caricature is the lofty claims of my fellow economists that we are good guys. We are immune to public choice theory. Everybody else, we do public choice theory. But for us, we are good guys and we should be given a free hand and we should do whatever we want. And there, I just say, nah, that's not how this works.
You don't just say nah. You don't just say that, Ajay Shah, but well done.
Yeah.
So, Ajay, take me into the engine room, right? In principle, I totally agree. It's such an elegant solution, looks great on paper. How does it actually work? Like, how do you do inflation targeting? What are your levers? What are your tools? What actually happens?
So the way in which good central banks work, and that word good is full of importance in the sentence. The way good central banks work is that there is only one price that they tinker with. They control only one price, and that is the short-term interest rate, which is a different way of saying they control the money base. Okay, so the money supply is not directly controlled. The short-term interest rate is directly controlled.
I mean, to take that metaphor of printing money, if the interest rates are really low, you
The
are
money base
effectively printing money because the money supply
dramatically.
expands. Yeah.
But what in all modern central banks, we are all Vixelian now, and the tool that is used is the short-term interest rate. All other interest rates on government bonds are left to the free market by sound-wise central banks. Okay? The idea is that the market knows best, that supply and demand on the market, the process of speculation by financial persons is the best way to discover a 6-month rate or a 1-year rate or a 10-year rate or whatever. Everything else is done by the market. The exchange rate is done by the market. Equity prices are done by the market. Everything markets know best. There is only one number, there is one lever that is used by the central bank, which is to control the short-term rate. Okay? So in the engine room, there's only one joystick where you are controlling the short-term rate. It's one scalar, so not even a joystick. Okay, it's not 2D, it's just 1D. So there's one potentiometer where you're controlling the short-term rate. The trouble is that there is a long lag between changing the interest rate setting and its impact on the economy. So changing the short-term rate does impact on inflation. We have no doubt that it does. In the long run, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, but the reaction times are slow. So think sluggish, like you turn the wheel of the car, but for a long time the car doesn't respond. Gradually the car responds, and now when you turn the wheel again, at that instant, the car is still responding to what you did with the wheel a while ago. That's the awkwardness, the difficulty of what the central bank has to do. It has to forecast the state of the economy. It doesn't suffice to look at inflation today. Okay, so now again, in developing countries like in India, the quality of the models is abysmal and you know next to nothing about what's going to come in the future. Fine, in that case, you respond to the present. Fine, okay? Or you be a very good economist and you have develop a sense about the economy and you can think about the future, but you know, that's difficult. I mean, in government settings, we are not able to establish those kinds of capabilities. But at its best, central banks should be capable of having a view about what will happen to inflation in the future and respond to that. So consider a time of a great boom. So, you know, remember what India was like in 2007 or in 1996, 1997. Oh, ye young readers of Everything is Everything. If you haven't lived in the glory years of 2007 and 1997, you have no idea what economic success looks like. You have just lived in some grim, dark days and you have normalized the sadness of what it means to be the Indian economy in the following years. But in those go-go years, what you will find is that there's a great boom going all around the economy and there will be inflationary pressure because inflation tends to go up in a boom. Okay. And at that time, the central bank will start raising rates because they are single-mindedly focused on inflation. So note, they're not supposed to look at the boom, they're supposed to look at inflation. And through that, over a long time period, it damps the economy and you get away from a crazy boom to a more normal environment. Flip it around. You've got a deep crisis. So by and large, around COVID, the Indian RBI played correctly that there was COVID. You didn't need data, you didn't need a model, you didn't need forecasts. The day the world's most extensive COVID lockdown was announced in India, you knew that this was going to be a really bad time for the economy. So RBI responded rapidly and rates came down dramatically. And then everybody's interest cost goes down, the firms have a little more space to breathe and people are a little more willing to borrow because the rates are lower, there's a little more home loans, there's a little more car purchased on an EMI and that helps to prop up the economy. Okay, so think this way that the central bank looks at inflation and it is accountable for the delivery of an inflation target. When there is a great boom in the economy, you get predictions of high inflation. The central bank responds by raising rates and then home loans become costly, car loans become costly, corporations always have debt, their interest cost goes up and the government has to spend more paying for its interest bills and that squeezes government non-interest expenditure and so on. And all this works in reverse when there are bad times in the economy. So this is the machinery about how the inflation targeting works inside the boiler room.
So, you know, we've had a lot of theory here, a lot of it made sense to me. So, thank you for being so lucid and clear about it. But now I want to bring out the storyteller in Ajay Shah. And I want you to tell me about the journey of making inflation targeting acceptable within the Indian policy community to the point that it actually happens. Like, you know, you've been talking about it with finance ministers from 2002 onwards, eventually happens in 2015. And a little, and lest some people wonder, and I did at first, that how do you decide what the inflation rate is? Well, number one, it should obviously not be zero, though that seems intuitive, but there are various problems with that. We don't need to go into the details, but you want to hedge against deflation. Deflation can send the economy into a vicious cycle, and if a vicious cycle where people aren't investing for the future because, hey, prices may go down, and etc., and it's terrible. So it can't be zero, but what should it be? And New Zealand and other advanced economies have 2%. A little birdie tells me that one of the co-hosts of this show is actually the person who decided it would be a band between 2 and 6% and 4 was ideal. And that person isn't me, so who could it be? Wink, wink. But take me through this whole journey, what it involved, what was the politics, how did the community adjust to it, and eventually to where things stand today.
So let me first just talk about the level, that how do you choose that level of inflation, and here it is a well-established fact that all the advanced economies are at 2%. Okay, so it seems natural that that's a baseline. You want to discuss an inflation target, it should be 2%. Now, what is wrong with a 2% target? The first problem is, as you said, that it's perilously close to zero. Okay, so now imagine I am a central bank and I'm just going to make up numbers that the non-accelerating inflation interest rate is 4% and I'm delivering an inflation rate of 2%. This is my normal world. Okay. Now the economy goes into a deep slump. How much headroom do I have to cut rates? I can only cut rates till 0, because below 0, I mean, a central bank can't make interest rates negative. Okay, they've done all kinds of valiant things, but really the power of monetary policy is to go from 4 to 0, not below that. Whereas if the inflation rate targeted was a little higher, like 4%, and the normal interest rate was like 6%, then you have much more headroom to be able to cut rates in bad times. Okay, so this is one reason why a little bit of a higher inflation may be appropriate under the conditions that we see in India. The second thing you have to think about is that the Indian financial system is deeply broken. Okay, so India has a really bad financial system. Now the effectiveness of the central bank works through the financial system. Okay, so I said things like the central bank cuts rates, then the home loans become cheaper, the car loans become cheaper, the financing of corporations becomes cheaper, but all this presumes a well-functioning financial system. So do these things happen? Do all these transmissions from the short rate of the economy to the functioning of the economy, do these things happen correctly? Do they take place? Okay, in India they don't. So now I want you to think intuitively that you have a less than effective monetary policy transmission because it's a bad developing country with a bad financial system. So the change of the interest rate that you want is higher and not smaller, right? So what in a sophisticated financial system would be a 25 or a 50 basis point change in interest rates? You would need a larger movement of interest rates in India to transmit a muffled sound through the financial system and to get your work done. So then again, you want bigger room to be able to get your work done. So this was the kind of reasoning why a rate like 4 made more sense. But wait, I just said that the monetary policy transmission is not very good. It's a bad financial system, and you know, for 20-30 years the financial system will not get fixed properly. Like nothing rapidly is going to happen in terms of improving the working of the financial system. In that case, the extent to which you have a control over the precise inflation rate is also weaker. Like things are happening and the central bank is not able to get it under control. It is an unreasonable task to ask the central bank that get me precisely 4.00. It's not going to happen. So it's better to put a band around that and say a target of 4 plus minus 2%. So it effectively becomes a permitted range from 2 to 6 centered at 4. So the target is 4, but getting it right in the range from 2 to 6 is considered acceptable. The central bank has an obligation to publish when the error, when the inflation rate goes beyond 6 and below 2 for 2 consecutive quarters or some such thing. They're supposed to be penitent and explain what went wrong, that I thought this, so I did this, but I was wrong and it did not work out, and here are the remedial measures I am taking. Okay, this kind of letter is supposed to be released in public by the central bank, and you know that is a tremendous reputational pressure for the central bank to get it right. But these are the kind of thinking that went into the choice of 4 and not 2, and a band 2 to 6 and not a number 4. Okay, this is all the thought process that went into getting to an Indian inflation targeting system. And the idea was, look, 10 more years will go by, hopefully FSLRC and the financial system will happen, and then in steps, first instead of plus minus 2% you could go to plus minus 1, and then eventually you can go to no band, and by that time India will be a member of the OECD. Okay, but these are all like very long journeys. What would be wise and optimal here is a target of 4 with a give of plus minus 2%.
I love the way you use phrases central bank and penitent in the same sentence. You know, it reminds me of the famous song, Please Forgive Me, No Matter What I Do. But just to come back to the story, tell me about, you know, because it's also a really interesting illustration of how policy changes move through the pipeline. And, you know, we've discussed it in our episode, The Long Road to Change. So briefly, because the sun is going down and it'll rise again tomorrow, such is the cycle of life. But briefly, you know, take me through what that process was like.
So in the beginning, in the bad old days, there was no meaningful central bank in India. It was just a central planning agency. It was a handmaiden of the government to grab money from the formal financial system and give it to the government and repress the formal financial system under a complete control system.
This is RBI you're
This is
referring
the
to.
RBI. So the beginning is just horrible, meaning many people like to write lofty histories and stories about the great days of the central bank. Like really, when you look at it, it was just an awful central planning organization with little by way of redeeming features. The modern journey really began in the early 90s. That sensible thinking about the RBI began only in the 90s. C. Rangarajan is the key figure, and there was a deputy governor named Tarapur, and these were key people who started thinking from scratch and understanding what is wrong with the RBI and how this stuff should be done differently. And so, I give them full credit. By the time I was getting to meet with them and talk with them in the 1990s, they had figured out the bulk of the story. So they knew the pieces. They knew that you had to open the capital account, you had to float the exchange rate, and you had to have an inflation target. By and large, they knew these things. Then RBI went into a long socialist period where it reverted back to much more of the central planning model and hostility to all these pieces. RBI wanted intrusive, detailed microeconomic control of the financial system, its role as a central planner of the economy rather than a central bank, and control of the exchange rate, and try to close the current account and the capital account as much as possible, and then not be held accountable for inflation. What accountability? I don't have, wait, let me remember, Montague, Norman, or Norman, Montague. Okay, just scratch that. I'm not getting the quote.
You want to look it up?
I'm looking it up. Norman Montague, the former central bank governor of the Bank of England, once famously said, "I don't have reasons, I have my instincts." Okay, it's like, don't hold me accountable. Don't ask me what am I doing and why. I'm some lofty character. There should be a mystique of central planning. This is all just nonsense. Oh, sorry, there should be a mystique of central banking. This is all just nonsense, and it should be swept away in the spirit of modern notions of public administration and public choice theory. So there was this bad period where really the intellectual leadership on what to do on monetary economics and finance was happening in academics, and it was happening through the Ministry of Finance. And there was a long simmering conversation around these questions on how to do things differently. I have described to you a 2002 conversation where I was speaking with Yashwant Sinha and talking about inflation targeting, and he was saying these ideas are way ahead of the Indian range of ideas amongst the intelligentsia, and they need to become much more normalized in the Indian intellectual debate before some future finance minister can do that. And point well taken. This is the way it should be done. And then in the mid 2000s, in the 2007 boom, the working of the RBI went phenomenally wrong. At a time when the economy was booming and a lot of foreign capital was coming into the country. See, these are correlated. When times are good, foreigners bring money into India. When times are bad, foreigners take money out of India. So at a time when the economy was booming and a lot of foreign capital was coming in, RBI tried to fix the exchange rate. Okay, so now foreign capital is coming into the country. The rupee ought to appreciate. They're preventing that appreciation by buying up the dollars. Okay, but when they buy the dollars, they pay for it in rupees, and so the local economy got flooded with rupees. And so it was expansionary monetary policy at the worst possible time, and that generated a nice big inflation crisis. And I think by and large, this won the case amongst the economists that this old RBI cannot just be accepted in the modern world. You now need to do better. And a critical milestone is FSLRC. In FSLRC, which began in 2011, there were rich internal debates, and the planning process took place to create an inflation targeting system in the...
What is the FSLRC?
The Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission was established in 2011. It was led by Justice Sri Krishna, and it had a group of wonderful people. My bit player role in that is I was hired by Sri Krishna to lead the research team of FSLRC, and that research team was 35 people at NIPFP, jointly led by Ila Patnaik and myself. Okay, so this is a rare government commission which was backed by technical capability. Okay, and the mandate was to zero base and think about what is the nature of monetary and financial law in India. So we had a chaos of some 60 odd old laws which had just become a mess, and the idea was come up with one single clean law with one consistent set of legal definitions at the beginning, which lays the foundation for financial regulation and the use of the coercive power of the state in finance and monetary policy and public debt management. And it is all done in one amazing document which is called the Draft Indian Financial Code. Okay, and that draft was released into the public domain, and inside it the chapters for the Reserve Bank of India were inflation targeting, monetary policy committee. So suddenly the whole thing started looking real and it started making sense. The first rev of the work of FSLRC was done in 2 years, 2011 to 2013. In 2013, the product came out. And P. Chidambaram was the finance minister, and he said, this is too big for us to do, and in any case, we're coming to the end of our government. And we won't be able to pass laws right now because they didn't even have a majority in the Rajya Sabha at that time. And then I remember once KP Krishnan and I were talking, we were kicking ideas around, and we said, do you remember in the 90s, there was a situation like this where there was a lack of ability to pass a law in the parliament. This is around automatic printing of money by RBI to fund the deficits of the government. Okay, another equally bad practice which had to be shut down, but they were not able to put it into laws at the time. So the strategy that was taken was that an agreement was signed, a contract was signed between the Ministry of Finance and RBI, where the Ministry of Finance promised to never ask and RBI promised to never give automatic monetization of deficits. Okay, and with much fanfare, there was a public ceremony, and Monte Ahluwalia and C. Rangarajan signed this document. It is called the Ways and Means Agreement. Okay, and it's a lovely milestone in the history of Indian monetary policy and public finance. Monetary policy, because that was freeing RBI of the distortion of coming up with a monetary policy of printing money that suits the deficit of the government.
And if I may think aloud, it benefited perhaps from Montek and Rangarajan being the two specific people there. If you had some other RBI governor who was not as enlightened, perhaps there would have been pushback.
Correct. And later on, it got put into law when the right time came. So Krishnan and I were arguing with each other. I remember I was traveling, I was not in the country at the time, and we were like intensively doing 4 emails per hour on these kinds of questions. And we said, you know, something similar could be done here. And imagine an agreement between the central bank and the Ministry of Finance, which we christened the Monetary Policy Framework Agreement, where both sides agree that the objective of RBI will be an inflation target, and the government commits that we will not push you in any other direction, and RBI commits that we will deliver you an inflation target. So that's how the Monetary Policy Framework Agreement was drafted. My team at NIPFP and I had something to do with the early version of the draft, which went up to the Ministry of Finance as a draft, and then it got kicked around by KP Krishnan and most importantly P. Chidambaram, who totally got all these things deeply. And this was discussed with Monte Ahluwalia and with Manmohan Singh, and then I think you've already discussed this scene several times before, that Chidambaram had this wonderful grace of writing on file that this is one of the most important milestones in the history of India, and I don't want to do it lightly, and it should not be the work of a lame duck government. By this time I think it was end 2013 or early 2014. So he says, I leave this to my successor. Elections will take place. Somebody will be the finance minister. It may not be me. Okay, he correctly predicted that he would not be the next finance minister, and you guys decide. And then Arun Jaitley came in as the finance minister, and he agreed that this was the right way to go. And that's
I want to tell that story again because it's such a beautiful story. And KP Krishnan said this to me in his episode with me, 8-hour masterpiece. Please listen, everyone. And the story essentially is that Jaitley comes into office, Krishnan goes and he gives him the file and says, like, this is really big, have a look at it. And it's perhaps, it is the evening of the day when this happens. And then the next morning, Jaitley calls him and he says, yeah, let's do it. And Krishnan is like, whoa, 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 I want to do this. It's important to do this, but you can't just say, yeah, let's do this like overnight. Have you actually read it? This is far reaching. It changes everything. Have you read it? So Jetli kind of gets a little irritated and says that, yes, I have, gone through it. But the important thing is this: if this country's finest economic mind and finest legal mind have said that this must be done, then who am I to argue? And the two people he was referring to were Manmohan Singh and P. Chidambaram. And this is Arun Jaitley speaking. And this is a grace. And for me, this is actually the end, because this never happens again. Our politics changes forever, and today on every side of the aisle, we have just a different class of people, but I don't want to go there.
Yeah. So finally on 20th of February 2015, there were some delays along this way. And on 20th of February 2015, Rajiv Maharishi and Raghuram Rajan signed the agreement. Sadly, they did not do this as a nice public show. I feel that would have helped. I said that there should be a public meeting where the signing happens, but that did not happen. So that is how you got to the agreement. And then in 2016, the RBI Act was amended to build in this and to build in a monetary policy committee. And this is a historic moment in Indian history for the following reason. When the British had created the Reserve Bank of India in 1934, they correctly understood that they don't understand. Okay, so in every law there is a preamble of some high-minded statement of purpose of what this law is intended to do. In the preamble of that RBI Act of 1934, the British had the following words, and I quote, where they say that in the present state of disorganization of the international monetary system, it is not present to determine the organization of monetary systems for India. And so as a temporary measure, we create the Reserve Bank of India. So the words "as a temporary measure" were there in the preamble of the act. Okay, so it's like there was a child who was a full-grown man standing in 2015, but on his forehead was the word "you're a temporary measure," because we haven't yet figured out what to do. And it gives so much pleasure that in 2016, when the law was amended, that text was removed and it was replaced by "in order to deliver price stability." So now, in 2016, after all these years, RBI found a purpose.
Thank you for your service.
This is all just great things to do. So we're at the end of this episode. Thank you for being with us, gentle reader. Out of talking about all this, my CPU power has dwindled away. Now I'm a Z80. So we shall ask Amit Bhai, what recommendations do you have?
So I have two recommendations. One is not a recommendation, it's just a recommendation in the singular, which is basically a recommendation to my gentle readers that never normalize anything or take the world for granted. Things can change. We achieved something beautiful called inflation targeting. It took a while. We got there. It is one rare, elegant piece of great legislation, but these things are always under threat. So I want you to not normalize, always keep thinking, always keep questioning. We've got to preserve the little good that we have done in the world, right? And on that note, my recommendation now is going to be music. It's an album by Joni Mitchell called Blue. It's a beautiful album. Joni Mitchell is a great singer-songwriter. She is also a masterful instrumentalist. Like the way she plays the guitar in some of the songs here, the way she plays the piano in some of these songs here. She was a genuine pioneer and way ahead of her time. People from within folk, within rock, within jazz, and she has collaborations with people like Mingus and Pistorius, if I'm not mistaken. All took inspiration from her work. Just a truly great artist. And Blue is my favorite album of hers. It's just beautiful, but listen to it with headphones on a quiet day when you're alone.
Yeah, I've looked at prices from both sides now.
Yeah, that's not from that album. It's not from that album, right? Yeah. All I really, really want. Anyway, so yeah. We're done. Thank you.
Should we walk a bit? Yes. So we'll just wander this way.
Yeah, don't ask for instructions. That should be natural.
So Amit Bhai, do you like the cannonball tree? Do you like the champa tree? Do you like the banyan trees? Did you know this is two banyan trees?
This is two banyan trees.
So all this is one tree.